In the summer of 1945, the Second World War was entering its final, brutal phase. In Japan, cities like Tokyo had been devastated by firebombing, but Hiroshima remained largely untouched. On the morning of August 6th, its citizens were beginning their day. They were unaware that for 3 years, 6,000 miles away, the United States had been running a secret program, a project that cost $2 billion and employed over 150,000 people, all to build a single weapon. A weapon based on a theory that the atom itself could be split to release an unimaginable power. This is the story of that weapon. It is the story of the Manhattan Project, a desperate race to build the atomic bomb, and of the scientists who were brought to a secret city to create a device they believed would finally end the war. The scientific origin of the project began in Berlin in December 1938. At the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, 2 German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were conducting experiments bombarding uranium with neutrons. They discovered something unexpected. The uranium atom had split in 2. This discovery was named nuclear fission by Lise Meitner, an Austrian physicist who had fled Nazi Germany. Physicists quickly realized the implications. When a uranium atom fissioned, it released a large amount of energy. More importantly, it also released additional neutrons. These neutrons could then go on to hit and split other uranium atoms. This was a chain reaction. Scientists understood that if controlled, this could be a new source of energy. But if it happened uncontrollably, it would create a bomb of unprecedented power. And the greatest threat was that this discovery had been made inside Nazi Germany. One of the first to understand this danger was the Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard. Szilard had fled Europe and was in the United States. He knew that if the Nazis weaponized this discovery, the results would be catastrophic. He felt he had to warn the US government, but he lacked the necessary influence. He decided to contact the most famous scientist in the world, Albert Einstein. In August 1939, Szilard and his colleague Eugene Wigner visited Einstein on Long Island. They explained the potential for an exceedingly powerful bomb of a new type. Einstein, a lifelong pacifist, immediately grasped the threat. He agreed to sign a letter. The letter was addressed not to the military, but directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter warned that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs. It also noted that Germany had already stopped the sale of uranium from the mines it controlled. The letter was given to Alexander Sachs, an economist with access to the president. However, Sachs could not get a meeting with Roosevelt for 2 months as the crisis in Europe escalated. On October 11, 1939, Sachs finally had his meeting. But as Sachs presented the information, the president seemed distracted. Realizing he was losing the president's attention, Sachs asked for a second meeting at breakfast the next day. That night, Sachs decided to abandon the complex scientific explanations. The next morning, he told Roosevelt a historical parable. Sachs described how the American inventor Robert Fulton had once offered to build Napoleon a fleet of steamboats, ships that needed no sails and could attack England in any weather. Napoleon had mocked the idea and sent Fulton away. Sachs concluded, if Napoleon had listened, the history of the 19th century might have been very different. Roosevelt was silent for a moment. He understood the analogy. He summoned his aide and said, "This requires action." That meeting led to the formation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium. Its initial budget was just $6,000. The committee's work was slow at first, but everything changed on December 7, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. America was now at war. The theoretical uranium bomb suddenly became an urgent military necessity. The project was handed over to the Army Corps of Engineers. It was given a new, secret code name based on its New York headquarters, the Manhattan Engineer District. The race had officially begun. To manage a project of this scale, the Army needed a specific kind of leader. They didn't need a scientist. They needed a builder and a manager with total authority. They chose Colonel Leslie Groves. Groves was an engineer. He had just overseen the construction of the largest office building in the world, the Pentagon. Groves was not pleased. He had been expecting a combat command overseas. Instead, he was promoted to brigadier general and put in charge of this secret, unproven project. Groves was a practical man. He accepted the assignment and immediately began work. His first decision was to secure the raw materials. He authorized the purchase of 1,200 tons of uranium ore that was stored in a warehouse in New York. His second decision was to approve the construction of massive industrial sites, even before the scientists were sure which method would work. He called this concurrency, doing everything at once. Groves now had the industrial and military authority, but he needed a scientist to lead the weapons laboratory, the person who would actually design the bomb. His choice was highly unconventional. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist at the University of California, Berkeley. He was brilliant. He understood all aspects of the physics, from neutron calculations to engineering. But he had no administrative experience. He had never managed a large project. Worse, in the eyes of Army security, he was a risk. Oppenheimer had many friends and associations linked to the Communist Party. His wife, his brother, and his former fiancée were all connected to communist causes. FBI security officials strongly advised against granting him clearance. But General Groves saw something different. He saw an ambitious and brilliant man who he believed was, above all, a patriot. When confronted with the security report, Groves famously wrote a memo stating, "In spite of the information, I directed that clearance be issued to Dr. Oppenheimer." Groves had made his gamble. Now they needed a location for this secret laboratory. It had to be isolated, secure, and far from any major population. Oppenheimer, who loved the Southwest, suggested a remote mesa in New Mexico. It was the site of the Los Alamos Ranch School, a small private school for boys. Groves approved it. The Army seized the land, and construction began immediately. The site was given the code name Site Y. To the outside world, it did not exist. Oppenheimer, now the director, began recruiting. He traveled to universities across the country, talking to the top physicists and chemists. He could not tell them exactly what they would be doing. He told them only that it was a secret project and that their work could end the war. They came. Enrico Fermi, the Nobel Prize winner from Italy who had built the world's first nuclear reactor. Hans Bethe, the German physicist who was a master of theoretical calculations. Edward Teller, a Hungarian physicist who was already focused on an even more powerful weapon. Richard Feynman, a brilliant and energetic young physicist from New York. One by one, the top scientists in the world disappeared from their universities. They arrived at a post office box in Santa Fe, P.O. Box 1663. They were driven up the hill to Los Alamos. Life at Los Alamos was isolated. It was surrounded by barbed wire fence. All mail was censored. All conversations were monitored. Scientists were forbidden to discuss their specific work with anyone, even their wives. It was a city of geniuses and a city of secrets, all focused on a single problem. That problem was the fuel. The scientists at Los Alamos were designing the bomb, but they needed the fissile material to put inside it. Natural uranium is mostly uranium-238, which is stable. The isotope they needed was uranium-235, which makes up only 0.7% of natural uranium. To make a bomb, they had to separate this tiny fraction of U-235. This was an enormous industrial challenge. General Groves, using his concurrency principle, funded two entirely different multi-billion-dollar methods to do this. The first method was gaseous diffusion. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the Army built a secret city of 75,000 people. At its center was the K-25 plant, the largest building on Earth at the time. Inside this mile-long building, uranium was converted into a gas. This gas was then pumped through thousands of porous barriers or filters. The lighter U-235 gas would pass through the filter slightly faster than the heavier U-238. This process had to be repeated thousands of times to get the uranium enriched to weapons grade. Most of the 75,000 workers at Oak Ridge had no idea what they were producing. But there was a second path. Back in 1942, Enrico Fermi had built a small nuclear reactor in Chicago. He proved that a controlled chain reaction was possible. This reactor also proved something else. When the common U-238 absorbed a neutron, it didn't fission. Instead, it transformed. It decayed into a brand new, man-made element. Element 94, plutonium. Plutonium was also fissile. It could be used to make a bomb just like U-235. And it was chemically different from uranium, so it could be separated much more easily. So Groves funded a second secret city. At Hanford in Washington State, the Army built massive nuclear reactors. These were not for power. Their sole purpose was to irradiate slugs of uranium, to breed plutonium. The plutonium was then chemically separated from the uranium in massive, remote-controlled buildings. This was a dangerous, toxic, and massive industrial effort. By 1944, the Manhattan Project was a vast, secret empire. Oak Ridge was slowly enriching uranium. Hanford was beginning to produce plutonium. And at Los Alamos, the scientists were designing the devices to use this material. It was then that they discovered a critical, catastrophic flaw. The plutonium from the Hanford reactors was not pure. It contained a contaminant, an isotope called Pu-240. This isotope was highly radioactive. It fissioned spontaneously. This meant it released random neutrons. This was a disaster for their bomb design. The design for the bomb was simple. It was a gun. You would take two subcritical pieces of material and fire one piece, like a bullet, into the other. This would create a critical mass, and the chain reaction would begin. This gun-type design was simple and reliable. They knew it would work for the uranium, but for the plutonium, it was useless. The random neutrons from the Pu-240 contamination would cause the plutonium to start its chain reaction too early, before the bullet was fully seated. The bomb would fizzle. It would melt and destroy itself in a small, conventional explosion. The entire multi-billion-dollar plutonium project was a failure. The scientists at Los Alamos were facing an impossible problem with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. We're committed to telling the full, factual story of these historical events. If you value this kind of detailed, straightforward historical content, we ask that you please subscribe to our channel. Your support makes these in-depth documentaries possible. Now, the story of how they solved the plutonium problem. Oppenheimer was forced to reorganize the entire Los Alamos laboratory. The gun design was set aside to be used only for the U-235. For plutonium, they had to pursue a radical, highly experimental idea that most had dismissed as too difficult. The concept was called implosion. The idea was this: instead of firing two pieces of plutonium together, you would start with a single subcritical sphere of plutonium. You would then surround this sphere with a perfectly symmetrical shell of high explosives. Then you would detonate all of those explosives at the exact same microsecond. The resulting explosive shock wave would crush the plutonium sphere inward, squeezing it like a giant fist until it reached supercritical density. This would happen so fast that the chain reaction would be complete before the fizzle could even begin. The engineering challenge was immense. The explosives had to be shaped into precise lenses to direct the blast inward. The detonators had to fire with a precision of a millionth of a second. If any part of it was asymmetrical, the plutonium would be squeezed out the side and the bomb would fail. It was a massive gamble, but it was their only option. As 1944 turned into 1945, the pressure on Los Alamos was immense. The war in the Pacific was escalating. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were resulting in horrific casualties. The U.S. military was planning for a full-scale land invasion of Japan, an invasion they projected could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. The military desperately needed the bomb. General Groves needed the bomb. Then, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For many of the scientists, this was a turning point. The original reason for the project, the race against Hitler, was gone. An intelligence mission called the Alsos mission had followed Allied troops into Germany. They had captured the German nuclear scientists, and they confirmed the Nazi bomb program was years behind. There had been no race. America was the only nation with this weapon. This news created a moral crisis for some. Joseph Rotblat, a Polish physicist, resigned from the project. Leo Szilard, the man who had written the original letter to Roosevelt, began a petition. The Szilard petition, signed by 70 scientists, argued against using the bomb on a civilian population. He urged the new president, Harry Truman, to use the bomb in a demonstration first, perhaps on an uninhabited island, to show its power and give Japan a chance to surrender. The petition was stopped by General Groves. He classified it and ensured it never reached President Truman. The military leadership and President Truman had a different perspective. The firebombing of Tokyo had already killed over 100,000 people, but Japan had not surrendered. To them, the bomb was a military weapon, a tool to force a surrender and avoid a bloody land invasion. Oppenheimer did not support the petition. His focus was on completing the mission. He later explained that the scientists were so focused on the technical challenge that they did not fully debate the consequences until after the weapon was built. The work accelerated. They now had two separate working designs. First, Little Boy. This was the simple gun-type bomb. It would be fueled by the enriched uranium-235, which was now arriving in small quantities from Oak Ridge. The design was so simple, they were confident it would work. they decided they would not even test it. Second, Fat Man. This was the highly complex plutonium implosion device. This was the bomb that was impossible. No one could be 100% certain that the complex system of wires and explosive lenses would actually work. They had to test it. President Truman was preparing to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. He wanted to know definitively if this new superweapon was real before he confronted the Soviets. The date for the test was set for mid-July 1945. A test device, an exact copy of the Fat Man bomb, was built. It was nicknamed the Gadget. It was transported 200 miles south to a remote stretch of desert, an area known as the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of the Dead. Oppenheimer gave the test site its final code name. He called it Trinity. This was the first nuclear explosion in history. The scientists had become engineers and bomb makers. They assembled the gadget in a farmhouse near the test site. The plutonium core was delivered and placed inside. The device was then hauled to the top of a 100-foot steel tower. They placed it on a tower for two reasons. First, to better simulate an airburst explosion. Second, General Groves had worried the test might fail, that the conventional explosives would detonate, but the nuclear chain reaction would not. He had a massive 200-ton steel vessel called Jumbo built to contain the explosion and recover the priceless plutonium. By the time of the test, the scientists were confident enough that Jumbo was left unused nearby. The test was scheduled for 4 a.m. on July 16th. The scientists were nervous. They had created a betting pool on the size of the explosion. Some bet it would be a dud. Enrico Fermi joked that he would take bets on whether the explosion would ignite the atmosphere and destroy the entire state of New Mexico. It was a joke, but it highlighted the profound uncertainty. Then, on the night of July 15th, a severe thunderstorm rolled into the desert. Heavy rain, high winds, and lightning. The test had to be postponed. At the top of the steel tower, the gadget was exposed to the elements. In the control bunker, 10,000 yards away, the mood was tense. Oppenheimer was visibly strained. General Groves was furious and blamed the meteorologist. The test was delayed from 4 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. Finally, around 4:45 a.m., the storm began to break. The winds died down. The rain subsided. The test was back on. The final countdown was automated. At T-minus 45 seconds, the sequence was locked. In the observation bunkers, scientists and soldiers were ordered to lie on the ground, feet toward the blast. They were given welder's glass to protect their eyes. Oppenheimer, in the control bunker, held his breath. T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The time was 5:29 a.m. The explosion was immediate and silent. First was the flash, a brilliant white light that filled the entire sky. It was brighter than the sun. It illuminated the mountains miles away, brighter than broad daylight. One scientist would later say, "We knew the world would not be the same." Then came the sound. It took almost a full minute for the shock wave to travel the 10,000 yards, a deafening, continuous roar that battered the observers and echoed across the desert for minutes. The heat could be felt even miles away. A massive mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. The steel tower was gone. It had been vaporized. In its place was a crater. The desert sand for hundreds of yards had been melted into a green, radioactive glass, which was named Trinitite. In the control bunker, the tension broke. There was relief. There was celebration. Oppenheimer, who had been watching, later said that at that moment he was reminded of a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a success. The yield was calculated at 21 kilotons, equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. It was far more powerful than most had predicted. The impossible implosion device worked. A coded message was sent to President Truman at the Potsdam Conference. It said, "Baby is born." Truman now had confirmation. He casually mentioned to Joseph Stalin that the United States had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, who already knew about the project from his spies, showed little reaction and simply said he hoped they would make good use of it against the Japanese. The stage was set for the weapon's use. The military decision was made. The targets were chosen. The Szilard petition for a demonstration was dismissed. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian. In its bomb bay was Little Boy, the untested uranium gun-type bomb. Its primary target was Hiroshima, a city that had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing, so it could serve as a clean target to measure the bomb's full effect. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb was dropped. It fell for 44 seconds and detonated at 1,900 feet above the city. The explosion was immediate. The Little Boy bomb had a yield of 15 kilotons. The city was destroyed. An estimated 80,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following days, weeks, and years from horrific burns and from a new unknown sickness, radiation poisoning. President Truman announced the bombing to the American public. He called it an atomic bomb, a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. At Los Alamos, there were celebrations. The scientists felt they had ended the war. But in Japan, the government, stunned and confused, did not immediately surrender. The military proceeded with the second attack. On August 9th, 3 days after Hiroshima, a second B-29 named Boxcar took off. This carried Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb, the same device tested at Trinity. The primary target was the city of Kokura, but the plane found the city covered by clouds. The bomber diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the Fat Man bomb was dropped. The plutonium bomb was more powerful, with a yield of 21 kilotons. It killed an estimated 40,000 people instantly. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. 5 days later, Emperor Hirohito, in his first ever radio broadcast, announced Japan's unconditional surrender. He cited a new and most cruel bomb. The war was over. The Manhattan Project was successful. It had cost $2 billion. It had employed 150,000 people, and it had ended the deadliest conflict in human history. The consequences were just beginning. The world had entered the nuclear age. A Cold War between America and the Soviet Union would be defined by a nuclear arms race. Edward Teller would go on to develop the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And what of the scientists? General Groves became a corporate executive. Many of the scientists, like Leo Szilard, became strong advocates for nuclear disarmament. They had seen what they had created. And J.R. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, became a national hero and then a tragic figure. He became a government advisor, but he was troubled. He told President Truman, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman later told his aides, "I don't want to see that crybaby scientist ever again." When Oppenheimer argued against the development of the H-bomb, his political enemies used his pre-war communist sympathies against him. In 1954, his security clearance was revoked. The man who had given America the atomic bomb was labeled a security risk. His public life was over. The Manhattan Project is not just history. It is the event that created the world we live in today. It gave humanity the power of its own destruction. The legacy of the Manhattan Project is a question that has not been answered. What do we do with the power we created? The decision to use the bomb is still debated today. Was it a military necessity to end a brutal war, or was it an act that should never have been taken? We want to know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments below.